Dr. TCA Raghavan, and dear participants, very good afternoon to tonight's webinar on the past and the future in India-Pakistan relations. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Neighborhood Studies is one of our major research centers at NICE. Neighborhood Studies looks at the range of cross-cutting issues such as political development, economic activities, cross-border activities, and foreign affairs and security surfacing in its immediate neighbor like India, China, in addition to its extended neighbors such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and Maldives. To talk on a very important and equally complicated issue today, which is India and Pakistan relations, we have invited Dr. TCA Raghavan, who is Director General of at Indian Council for World Affairs, New Delhi. Dr. Raghavan needs no introduction to those who follow Pakistan and India relations. I would like to briefly introduce him. Dr. TCA Raghavan retired from the Indian Foreign Service in December 2015, while Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan, where he served from 2013 to 2015. He had earlier served as Deputy High Commissioner in Pakistan, 2003 to 2007, and a High Commissioner to Singapore from 2009 to 2013. During his last posting in New Delhi at the Ministry of External Affairs, Dr. Raghavan was Joint Secretary dealing with Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. He had also served in Kuwait, the United Kingdom, and Bhutan. Posts earlier held in the Ministry of External Affairs include Director of the Office of External Affairs Minister, 2002-2003. He was awarded PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University in 1992 for his dissertation relating to the economic history of India. His current interests are historical research, strategic analysis, and the diplomatic and intellectual history of modern India. He writes lectures and participates in discussions on issues relating to India and South Asian diplomatic history, Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, and Southeast Asia. He is the author of several books, to mention few: Attendant Lords, Bairam Khan and Abdur Rahim, Courtiers and Poets in Mughal India, for which he was awarded the Mohammad Habib Memorial Prize by the Indian History Congress in December 2017. The next book is The People Next Door, The Curious History of India's Relations with Pakistan, published by Harper Collins in 2017. And his latest book is entitled Historymen, Jadunath Sarkar, G.S. Sardesai, Raghubir Sinh, and his quest for India's past in 2019. Dr. Raghavan, you will have around 30 minutes maximum to make your initial presentation, which will be followed by questions and answers. We request our participants to type their questions in the chat box or under Facebook Live. Thank you. Dr. Raghavan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Jaiswal, for inviting me, and I'm very happy to have been given this platform by the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, and it gives me a chance to talk to friends and students and analysts in Nepal, and possibly also some in India and in Pakistan. I think it is important that all of us remain engaged and also understand the complexities of different interstate relations in South Asia, because the only way one can become a responsible citizen of South Asia is by understanding these complexities to different country relationships. Now, my talk today is on India-Pakistan relations, but let me begin with a general proposition, which is about relations between neighbors. And I think we often tend to underestimate how difficult neighboring country relationships can be. Students of India-Pakistan relations, or those who have handled at a policy level issues relating to India and Pakistan, feel that there is something exceptional about this relationship in terms of the legacy issues and also the current issues of mistrust, distrust, suspicion, antagonism, etc., etc., which it has, which it carries and has. But if we reflect on it, you will find that many relationships between neighbors have also been exceptionally difficult. And perhaps the greatest challenge which any country's diplomacy faces is in addressing relationships between neighbors. So if one looks at the world around us and look at different neighboring country relationships, at one end of the spectrum, you may have something like North and South Korea, which is by any standards an exceptionally bad bilateral relationship. You also have the situation of Israel and some of its Arab neighbors. At the other end of the spectrum, you have relationships between possibly US and Canada, between certain countries in the European Union, between, there are good examples also, if one looks around the world. And what is interesting is the middle of this spectrum. And there you find that all neighboring country relationships have a great deal of complexity to them. For instance, if you look at Japan, China, you look at South Korea, Japan, and in that context, the question always arises of where in this spectrum, when you move from good to bad, where should one place a particular neighboring country relationship? For instance, in this spectrum, where would you place India and Pakistan? Now, there a lot depends on what perspective you adopt, on where to situate India and Pakistan in a spectrum of neighboring country relationships. I often remember what my colleague in Islamabad, the South Korean ambassador, once told me in 2013 or 2014. And he said that, Ambassador, I envy you the relationship you have with Pakistan. You have trade of about $2.5–3 billion. Your people are in constant touch with each other through people traveling between both countries. You have large elements of cultural commonality, and there's a lot of cultural exchange, etc., etc. Now, I always felt that India-Pakistan relations are very bad, and it's a good example of how bad a country's relationship with its neighbor can be. But if you see India-Pakistan relations from the perspective of North Korea and South Korea, you will then come to the conclusion that perhaps things are not as bad as you would like to assume. So a lot depends on what perspective you adopt. But certainly, I would say that whenever one discusses India-Pakistan relations or any neighboring country relationship, it is important to keep in mind the broader perspective that relations between neighbors are often very, very difficult. There is also no straightforward way of improving relations, because there is, as I said, a great deal of legacy and history and different views and different perspectives on that history which are at play. For a long time, it was believed that if you have more economic exchanges, more economic interconnections, political relations will automatically improve. But in fact, there is no linear way forward. If you look at two examples today, India and China. India and China have a very strong economic relationship. China is in fact India's largest trading partner. There is a great deal of potential in the economic relationship. But despite that, it is not as if the political relationship immediately improved. And you have to see the situation today between India and China to understand what I am saying. You could also look at the case of India and Nepal. India and Nepal have so much in common. There is such a great amount of economic linkages, other forms of exchanges, great deal of commonalities. But that does not mean that in a linear or straightforward way, that will mean that there are no political issues between the two countries. My point simply is that neighboring country relationships are very difficult, and it's useful to keep that in mind when we look at the case of India-Pakistan relations. The second general observation I wanted to make was about the role of regional associations in improving bilateral relationships. And here, again, and this is by way of introduction, it is useful to always keep in mind the contrasting trajectories of ASEAN and SARC. And the question always is that why has ASEAN been relatively so much more successful than SARC has? And why does SARC have so much unutilized potential? Now, there are again no straightforward answers to these questions. Is the answer because in South Asia we have in fact much more convergences in terms of language, ethnicity, overlapping, overlaps of religion, and many other common factors, and these commonalities prevent the development of closer relationships between sovereign countries? Or is the answer somewhere else? Again, there is no clear answer, but this contrast as to why certain regional associations work well and others do not is something to think about and reflect on. Now, let me come to India-Pakistan relations, and let me share with you a slide which summarizes the current context of India-Pakistan relations, looking at the last 5 years or so. I hope the slide is visible. I've just put in bullet point form certain important developments, and I hope these are visible. I presume they are. So this really summarizes what has happened between India and Pakistan in the last 5 years. And as you can see, while the picture has been quite a negative one, it is not a totally negative one. There have been moments and there have been periods where it appeared that many possibilities are opening up and that there is a great deal which is possible. On the other hand, there have been periods when relations have deteriorated very sharply, particularly in the aftermath of terrorist attacks which have been carried out in India. Now, there are, of course, certain complexities which have further emerged in the last 1 year, given Pakistan's position with regard to the legislative changes carried out in India on the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir, now 2 separate union territories. But the interesting thing, and this is something I would draw to your attention, is that even if you look at the last 5 years, and which has not been a particularly good period in India-Pakistan relations, the point is that there has never been a situation when it looked as if the situation is totally bleak. And I would draw your attention in particular to something which happened in November 2019, which was the opening of a corridor to enable Sikh pilgrims from India to travel visa-free into a Gurdwara which was in Pakistan. The name of the Gurdwara is Kartarpur Sahib. Now this event is significant because it shows that even at a very bad time of India-Pakistan relations, there is a certain internal dynamic at work which enables important steps forward to be taken. And I think this factor, that even in the midst of crisis periods, there are possibilities of situation improving, is something which is very, very important whenever one looks at India-Pakistan relations in any depth. By saying this, I don't mean to don't mean to minimize the, the fact that both India and Pakistan have many and various fundamental differences on a whole range of issues, and I'll come to them as we go along. And many of these differences and disputes are well known. But the interesting point in India-Pakistan relations, and especially, and this comes out even in the last 5 years, which has been on the whole a very bad period in India-Pakistan relations, that it is not as if the period has been uniformly bad. There are certain internal cycles, even in these 5 years when relations have been at a low. And these cycles, to my mind, tell you something about the quality and the nature and the texture of this particular bilateral relationship, especially if one views it objectively. Now, the last 5 years are not really unique, because if you look back at a longer period, and I have again summarized the last 20 years, that will give a similar picture too. This is, for instance, the last 20 years, if you look at what has happened between India and Pakistan, and there's a whole host of negatives, beginning with a major conflict in Kargil when Pakistani troops attempted to intrude into Indian territory and had to be forcibly evicted. Thereafter, there was that major incident of a hijacking of an Indian aircraft from Kathmandu, and it finally landed up in Kandahar, and the passengers were only freed after a number of terrorists and militants had to be released by India under duress. There were attacks on our parliament. There were attacks on civilian targets in Mumbai on a number of occasions, and so on and so forth. I mean, if you scroll through this, if you go through this list, you will get a bird's eye view of all the negatives, or many of the negatives, in India-Pakistan relations in the last 20 years. But again, if you see the last 20 years, you will find that the picture is by no means an unmixed one, because you also have a number of positives, and very significant positives in terms of political advances, in terms of people-to-people exchanges, in terms of the line of control which divided Jammu and Kashmir from Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, opening up the line of control to travel and trade, etc., etc. So there have been many significant steps forward, and some of them were optically very, very powerful moments. For instance, you had the Lahore Declaration in 1999 that followed the then Prime Minister of India, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, traveling to Lahore in a bus, very symbolic gesture of the requirement for India and Pakistan to improve their relations. You similarly had a very powerful gesture when Prime Minister Narendra Modi invited all the Sark leaders to attend his swearing in May 2004, and the then Prime Minister of Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif, attended. About a year and a half later, you had Prime Minister Modi suddenly visiting Lahore to meet Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. These are all very, very important political gestures. So, as I said, if you look at the last 20 years, the positives and the negatives have been also mixed up much in the same way as they have been mixed up in the last 5 years. So, again, if you look at these two time periods objectively, I don't think anyone can deny that the negatives are preponderant. Certainly the negatives outweigh all the positives. But the fact is that the positives have also been there, and real possibilities of relations improving have been there at certain points of time. So the question really for students and analysts of India-Pakistan relations is what stops these possibilities from materializing, from acquiring traction, from developing into real, sustainable, forward-looking initiatives. It is not as if the possibilities are absent. The question is, what prevents the possibilities from acquiring traction and momentum and becoming sustainable? And this is a question perhaps which requires a lot of reflection and a lot of analysis. But the question certainly is an important one. The other point I wanted to mention is that it is important that we see India-Pakistan relations in a wider context. What is that wider context? I think that wider context has to be both regional as also international. India-Pakistan relations are not in a self-contained universe of their own, where Indians and Pakistanis are doing as they wish. In fact, regional factors and international factors, the wider geopolitics, has a great bearing on this bilateral relationship. It has always been so from the 50s, and it is certainly true today also. And I think to understand the present conjuncture again, it is important that we look at two critical years. And I always find that these 2 years are very, very useful to understanding the current situation for India-Pakistan relations and indeed for politics in South Asia as a whole. The first of these 2 years is 1979. And 1979 was in many ways a formative year for South Asian geopolitics as a whole. And again, I've just listed some of the factors over here which have a direct bearing on India-Pakistan relations. But in fact, in this year in 1979, there was a great deal else also happening. Many people say that in fact, the 21st century began in 1979. Basically, South Asia's regional context altered very, very radically in that year. Because of the revolution in Iran, because of the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan, because of domestic changes in Pakistan, and in particular, the execution of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, which was a setback to forces of democracy in Pakistan, from which they have still not recovered. There was the rise of Islamic extremism in many countries in West Asia and in the Gulf. There were very important developments taking place in China as China embarked upon its modernization program. And you have the crystallization of an alliance, almost an alliance, and certainly a concert between China and the United States. All of these factors played a great role in molding the politics, the geopolitics of South Asia, and in particular had an impact on India-Pakistan relations. And we can come to the details when we discuss this. But I briefly wanted to touch on this year and then mention a second year, again very important, which is 1989. Again, 1989 is a fundamental year in terms of the geopolitics of South Asia, principally because of the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, but also because this was a time when there were fundamental changes taking place in Europe, in the Soviet Union, in China, as also in India, because it is no coincidence that you have the beginnings of an insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir at the same time as the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan is completed. And the question obviously is that in what way are these two events related to each other? And obviously, to a great extent, the relationship lies in Pakistan. And let me be very brief here because I don't want to spend too much time on this issue. But in brief, I think in Pakistan, the perception or the impression grew that the template which was applied to Afghanistan, which was in terms of creating a force of militias or militants who were ideologically and religiously motivated. The feeling in Pakistan was that if this model worked so successfully in Afghanistan, it could also be applied to Jammu and Kashmir. And it's, as I said, no coincidence that an insurgency begins in Jammu and Kashmir around the same time as the Soviet withdrawal in Afghanistan. Both of these created a mood of triumphalism in Pakistan, and the consequences of that, of all that happened in 1989, as indeed 1979, there's a certain residual impact of these 2 years which continues up to our own times. The point really is what I said, that it is important that we don't see India-Pakistan relations as a self-contained combination or a self-contained paradigm, but really see it as something which is impacted by larger forces, both regional and global forces or geopolitical factors. And certainly, like all other relationships, what happens in the wider universe has a great impact. I have a few more minutes, I think, so I'll try to rapidly come to the topic of this lecture, which is what happens in the future. There's a very well-known saying attributed to Natwar Singh, who was High Commissioner, who was Indian High Commissioner in Pakistan in the 1980s. He was thereafter External Affairs Minister of India. And at one point, when someone, he writes in his memoirs that what is the future of the India-Pakistan relationship? And the answer he gave was that the future lies in the past. So is this true? In what sense does the future lie in the past? I think if I have to summarize 2 points which I made at the outset, which is that neighboring country relationships are difficult, but India-Pakistan relations from time to time shows a great deal of possibilities and potential. I think the future will also be something like what has happened in the past, that there will be cycles. Things will look up and then they will look down again, and again there will be a period when they will look up, and so on. I think that is inevitable. India-Pakistan relations, like many neighboring country relationships, will never be a smooth, monochromatic process. It will always be complicated. It will always come up against roadblocks. There will be periods of intense friction, and so on. The challenge before diplomacy is as to how to moderate the ups and the downs, that you don't let relations, you don't get relations deteriorate too much. How do you moderate the swings, especially the downward swings? The swings are inevitable, given the nature, given the history, given the fundamental differences of many issues. But how do you moderate the downward spiral which will happen from time to time? I think that is the real challenge before Indian and Pakistani diplomacy. I'm running out of time, but I will share one final thought which applies to many countries which have highly securitized relationships with their neighbors. Now, India-Pakistan relationship is, in many senses of the term, a highly securitized relationship. The effort has always been to try to desecuritize it. And in the last 50, 60 years, there have been 3 major attempts at desecuritization. Two of these were unsuccessful. One has been reasonably successful. The successful effort was in the form of the Indus Waters Treaty, whereby India and Pakistan reached a very pragmatic, workable arrangement regarding sharing of river waters. The unsuccessful efforts at desecuritization have been in the realm of trade, and secondly, in the realm of energy, which was of building a gas pipeline from Iran to Pakistan to India. Both of these were unsuccessful attempts. They were failures. But I think one part of the future also is to think about desecuritization. And this is especially so at a time like this, when we are in the midst of a major pandemic. All of South Asia is the victim of this pandemic in one form or the other. And certainly the economic downturn, the economic contraction is going to have a pretty catastrophic effect on all of us. How we can think about facing up to this particular challenge, I think will possibly give us some leads also on how to desecuritize the relationship. I don't want to take too much time because often in these discussions, the most interesting parts are in the question and answers. So I'll stop here and again thank Dr. Pramod Jaiswal and the Nepal Institute of International Cooperation and Engagement for having invited me. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Raghavan, for a very comprehensive and enlightening presentation. I really got to learn a lot about these two countries. We have received a huge number of questions, so let me share the questions with you. The first question is, we have already witnessed uneasy relations between India and Pakistan for more than 7 decades in the past. As geography has placed them unchangeably together, they have no other options except to create conducive environment to live together. When do you foresee the possibility of the two nuclear power nations to realize their geopolitical compulsive reality and cost associated to their enmity and come up with amicable solutions and resolutions and turn the enmity into enduring friendship? This is the first question. What is the role of China in India-Pakistan relations? So second is on China factor in India-Pakistan relations. And third, do you think SARC can play any role to resolve India-Pakistan issues?
Okay. Well, thank you. Very good questions, each of them. Firstly, about the future. I think it is important that while we should have aspirations of the kind which were implicit in the question, it is also important that one is realistic. And being realistic means that there are many differences between India and Pakistan to which there is no easy or available answer. Because these are not engineering problems or these are not mechanical problems. Many of these are related to issues of identity and different readings of history. Now, if you look at something like Kashmir, to which Pakistan attaches so much importance, because K in Pakistan stands for Kashmir. Most people or many people in Pakistan feel that their nationhood is not complete without Kashmir becoming a part of Pakistan. In India, the view is diametrically opposite. For all Indians would say that Kashmir is an integral part of India, and the only part of this issue which remains to be resolved is that part which is illegally in the control of in the occupation of Pakistan. So, you know, these are two different readings of a long history, and there is a great deal of identity and sense of nationhood which is tied up in these questions. Nobody can resolve these questions easily. There is no magic bullet or silver bullet which has the solution, and the task is not to look for that silver bullet. The task is to understand that you have widely divergent and differing points of view, and you need processes by which you manage your relations, notwithstanding these disputes and differences. Now, this is precisely where the challenge of neighborhood diplomacy comes in. So yes, I would agree in brief that India and Pakistan must find workable solutions, recognize the geopolitical responsibility and the common challenges they face in terms of economic development, addressing real aspirations of the people. But so I say, yes, it is important that we take all that into account. But to be realistic, we must understand that there is going to be no solution which is suddenly going to appear. We need to think of long-term processes which are sustainable, which will improve the overall atmosphere and the overall atmospherics between the two countries. And it's going to be a long and grinding process which one will have to embark upon. The second question is of the role of China. Now, the role of China in India-Pakistan relations has been there from the 1960s. To some extent, such a role is inevitable. When you have two neighbors, and especially neighbors of differing sizes and of different size of economies, population, geographical size, etc., it is natural that the smaller neighbor will try to balance the larger neighbor by bringing in external powers. So Pakistan first sought to do this with the United States, but over the 20th century, over the 21st century, its relationship with the United States has eroded, and now it has brought in China largely to play the same role of balancing India. In geopolitics, these things happen. There's nothing malified in it. This is the way the world works and has always worked. I think the role of China from Pakistan's perspective will always be that of a strategic balancer to India. But the role from China, from India's perspective, is not to be seen vis-a-vis what it does in Pakistan, but really in terms of our own bilateral relationship with Pakistan and the potentialities for cooperation between India and China. Now, this picture is complicated somehow, complicated a great deal because of the adversarial relationship, the historical adversarial relationship which has existed between China and India. So between the three, you have this somewhat complex triangle of Pakistan using China to balance India, India trying to keep China at a bilateral level and not letting it come into Pakistan-India matters. And I think China increasingly seeing India from a prism which is wider than that of just Pakistan or its relations with Pakistan. So it's going to be a complex matter as we go ahead. The third question was on the role of SARC. Well, I think to my mind, SARC has no political role where it comes to resolving political differences between its member states. The role of SARC really lies in trying to foster a spirit of regional cooperation. And perhaps it would have been more successful if it had, or if its members had seen its role in that limited, through that limited prism, rather than trying to do too many things at the same time. I think realistically, India and Pakistan with populations of 1.1 or 1.2 and a large population in Pakistan, also it's the 5th or 6th largest country in the world. I think it is realistic that that we understand that there is very little outsiders can do to have a role in India-Pakistan matters. And I think one of the factors which will help SARC a great deal will be in seeing that this that its role is to foster regional cooperation rather than trying to reinvent a larger than life role for itself in terms of mediating between neighbors who have disputes. I think this is not just in the case of India, Pakistan. There are other factors in South Asia also, and I think SARC, if it remains limited to its role in very important role, incidentally, of fostering regional cooperation, it will be much more effective.
So let me move to the second set of questions. Given the nature of tensions between the two neighbors, what concrete confidence building measures would you suggest? Second is, how do you look at Modi's Pakistan policy? Is it different from UPA? Do you think Modi's policy towards Pakistan is better than the previous governments? Third is, where do you see Pakistan in Modi's neighborhood policy? How is it possible to see all neighbors, China, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Afghanistan, Maldives, and others through same lens with same policy?
Well, to answer the third question first, I don't think it's possible to look at all neighbors and have a uniform policy. I mean, if you look at the geographical spread of India, on the one hand, we have a relationship with Sri Lanka, and it's always going to be a relationship which is largely maritime in nature. On the other hand, you have relations with Bhutan and Nepal, and these are relations with landlocked countries, a different set of challenges. And then you have Bangladesh, you have Pakistan. I should have mentioned Maldives in the maritime. So obviously, the relationship cannot be a common one, except on certain fundamental issues that there should be more understanding, more cooperation, more trade, etc., etc. But given the spread and given the historical evolution of different parts of South Asia, each relationship will have a large distinctive flavor to it. So India's relations with Nepal will never be the same as India's relations with Sri Lanka or with Bangladesh, because each of them is a product of different processes and different histories. So I don't think one can think of a uniform approach, except at a very general level. The second point was about confidence building measures. Well, there are many confidence building measures which both sides know what they are. And these confidence building measures reduce tensions very dramatically, very quickly. I think the central issue in India-Pakistan relations, which has been there for the last 20 years, but has acquired a certain cutting edge now, is on the question of terrorist groups in Pakistan. And this issue is particularly difficult because it directly impacts public opinion in India. And no government, no matter how committed it is to improving relations with Pakistan, can afford to ignore public opinion on this issue, because public opinion can bring to bear an almost unbearable pressure on whichever is the government of the day. And this really, I think to my mind, the biggest confidence building measure would be for Pakistan to understand this and realize that these terrorist groups, which it regards as being its assets to achieve political objectives, are in fact not assets, but great liabilities, not just because of its relations with India, but because of its relations with many other countries, in fact, the rest of the world. I think about these terrorist groups. Now, these groups have a long history. It is not as if something can be done overnight, but certainly strong political statements against groups which have a freedom to operate in Pakistan. I think something like that will make a big difference and will act as a major confidence building measure. The third question was on Prime Minister Modi's Pakistan policy, and is it different? Is it the same? Well, it's always possible to find elements of continuity, but also major changes. But one thing which is distinctive in Prime Minister Modi's Pakistan policy came out very strongly in the first 2 years of his government, his first tenure in office, which is from May 2014 till about May 2016. And there you saw a policy which was essentially saying, or which was the Prime Minister saying to Pakistan, that I am prepared to put my personal political capital into improving India-Pakistan relations. And you saw this by the invitation to Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif to attend his swearing in. You saw this in his very dramatic gesture of visiting Lahore in December 2015. So really, it was a sign, if you needed one, that this was the Prime Minister of India preparing to invest his personal political capital in India-Pakistan relations. Now, unfortunately, this does not work. And the reason why it didn't work has less to do with India and more to do with internal developments in Pakistan. But the fact is that it gave you a sense of where the Prime Minister wanted to take his government's policy on Pakistan. It didn't work as a different matter, and there were terrorist attacks which required certain strong tactical responses. That's a different story. But if you're looking for an insight into thinking about Pakistan, I think the first 2 years of the government gave a pretty good answer.
Let me move to the next round of questions. These are a bit tricky and bit, don't you see that an independent state of Kashmir is the only solution to these long-standing issues between India and Pakistan? One. Second, what do young minds of Pakistan think about Kashmir? Third is, if East and West Germany could unite, why can't India and Pakistan unite? Do you see any possibility of them being united?
Well, I don't see any prospects for an independent state of Kashmir for the simple reason that nobody really wants it. I think Pakistan doesn't want it. India certainly doesn't want it. And in my reckoning, I don't think most people in Kashmir want it. It's a good headline, but it's not more than that. So I don't see any realistic prospects for that. And in any case, the history of South Asia shows that when you try to look for the essence of an issue or the essence of a sentiment or the essence of a people, you are like peeling an onion. So Kashmir is also like India is, or like Nepal is, or like Pakistan is the accumulation of different processes, different ethnic groups, different religions, different ethnicities, different languages. So you cannot say that part X is more important than the rest. So I think, which is why I say that I don't see this particular option as a solution of any seriousness. The second, I'm sorry, what was the second question?
The second question was, do you think that independent state of Kashmir is the only solution? That is the first. Second, what do young people in Pakistan think about Kashmir?
Well, it's very difficult to say, to say what young people want, because young people is not a rigorous category. I think there are different answers. Different young people think in different ways. I don't think one can aggregate it into one response. My sense is that young people in Pakistan, like young people in India, or like young people in Kathmandu, or young people anywhere else, want to really get on. And they don't like the legacy issues of the past weighing down and muddying the waters of their futures. So my sense of young people in Pakistan is that they would like to move on. They would like to have. They would like to be in a space which has better regional connectivity, in which the image of their country internationally is better, where they can travel freely, where they don't themselves face the danger of extremist and terrorist attacks. So I think that this is what young people in Pakistan want, and want also with regard to Kashmir. You see, because when you're discussing Pakistan and Kashmir in a serious way, it is also useful to recall uh, that how much of Pakistani strategic thinking is dominated by the Pakistani military. And military thinking is quite different from the way civilians think. And this is because, and this is particularly so in Pakistan. In Pakistan, the military, for a long period, because they have been running the country, they have a great say in governance issues that should otherwise have been the case. There's a tendency to think that national security is national interest. And they think of Kashmir in terms of national security, that Kashmir is vital to our national security, and this is the national interest. But this is not the right way to think about these issues. National interest has many components. National security is one of those components, but the other components are economic growth, employment, public health, education, etc., etc. So I think this non-securitized, non-military way of thinking is vital. And I think in Pakistan, many young people are now questioning this highly securitized discourse, both with regard to India and also with regard to Jammu and Kashmir. The third question was, I'm sorry again, I've forgotten.
The possibility of unification of Pakistan and India, like West and East Germany united.
I don't think there's any possibility. I think Pakistanis, like Indians, are deeply nationalistic people. They feel they are Pakistanis. So I don't think there's any question of East and West Germany type of situation happening between India and Pakistan. The issue is not that. The issue is, how do you improve relations between India and Pakistan rather than trying to merge India and Pakistan into one entity?
Let's move to the other round of questions. Don't you believe that if both the countries increase their bilateral economic ties, that would ensure that relation would not deteriorate too much? Or, as you say, help moderate the down spiral from time to time? That is first. Second, India has heavily invested in Afghanistan. Given Pakistan's close relation with Taliban, how would you see the peace process in coming times? Third is, how do you see the role of Pakistan in Afghanistan affecting Afghanistan's national interest post-US exit in Central Asia?
Well, as I mentioned, for a long time, many people felt, and there was good reasons for thinking like that, that economic linkages, trade will help moderate India-Pakistan conflicts. Unfortunately, it hasn't quite worked. Now, whether it has not worked because the potential was exaggerated or because the economic path was never given a fair chance, we don't know. Maybe the answer is a bit of both. But I think we should Frankly, I think the economic linkages, trade and so on do play some role in moderating conflict. But I think we should understand the limitations of that role. And this is particularly because when you're looking at India and Pakistan, because the size of the two economies is so different, and too much of an economic linkage leads to the other political consideration that the Indian economy is dominating the Pakistani economy. So I think economic linkages, trade, commercial transactions, investments, all that has a role, but we should understand that that role has its limitations, and that the political and that politics and the political realm has its own autonomy. In India, for instance, there is a great deal of discussion, and certainly for a long time we thought that the economic relationship with China is a very powerful instrument for normalization of relations between the two countries. But because the nature of the two economies is different, that led to a major trade imbalance between India and China. And that trade imbalance leads to a certain political, it has a certain political implication also. So when you're looking at economies which have which don't have that many complementarities, there's always the risk of too much economic integration leading to other problems. And this is so not just between India and Pakistan. The trade imbalance issue is something which we have to deal with all our neighbors in South Asia. And there's no easy solution to it, just like there is no easy solution to the trade imbalance which we have with China. So I would say that yes, the economic aspect, the economic instruments have a role, but we should be mindful of keeping their roles. We should be mindful of understanding the limitations of those roles. The question was about Indian investments in Afghanistan and how will that change. I think people have a misunderstanding about Indian investments in Afghanistan. To my view, in my view, these are not investments in the sense people understand investments. This is not a commercial investment which India has to protect or which India has a risk of losing. The investments were investments in public goods. It was investment in education by way of scholarships. It was investments in transportation and communications by way of building roads. It was investment in hospitals. It was basically an investment in Afghanistan, in the friendship of the Afghan people. Now, it's not therefore an investment which we can lose or which we have to protect. It is for the Afghans to safeguard these investments, not for us. And as far as India is concerned, the dividends which we have got in terms of the goodwill and the friendship which this investment in public health, education, roads, bridge, hydroelectric projects, etc., has led to has more than paid whatever these investments cost. So I don't think this is really tied in any way to the future of Afghanistan. As I said, this is a public good which the people of Afghanistan themselves have to protect, or otherwise. What happens in its future is really something for the Afghans and the Afghan people and their government and their representatives to decide. India comes in only because they want you to be in. Otherwise, we have no real role there. The other question was of Pakistan-Afghanistan relation. Actually, it's a very complicated relationship, and in fact illustrates what I said about neighboring country relationships being very difficult. Pakistan-Afghanistan relations have been notoriously difficult from the time that Pakistan came into existence. The only country which objected to Pakistan becoming a member of the United Nations was Afghanistan. and they objected because they said that the western borders of Afghanistan are an infringement of Afghan territorial sovereignty. To this day, Afghans don't recognize the Durand line as a border. And by Afghans, I include both Taliban, non-Taliban government, etc., etc. So it's a very complicated relationship. Like all neighboring country relationships, these complexities and complications are built in. I think since 1979, and especially since 1989 and 1992, the way the Pakistanis have handled this relationship has made it worse. Because instead of trying to be a benign and good neighbor, they have tried to be a player in Afghanistan and trying to decide what Afghanistan and what Afghans should do and not do. And this has backfired on them very, very comprehensively. In many ways, Pakistan has made tremendous sacrifices where it comes to helping Afghanistan people in terms of refugees, putting up refugees for a long period of time, looking after them almost as if they are their own citizens, etc., etc. But all that effort means nothing because in Afghanistan, Pakistan is seen as a very bad neighbor. And it is essentially because they feel that Afghan sovereignty is subject to their veto. And this is something that no sovereign country will accept.
Thank you, sir. Where do you see the US role when it comes to India and Pakistan relations? Like in the past, US had close ties with Pakistan, but at present we see India getting closer to United States. Second is, what is the role of Russia on the issue of Kashmir and India-Pakistan relations? Do you think Russia is a balancer in the region, plays a significant role when there is crisis between India and Pakistan or India and China? And third is, it is often mentioned in media that Vajpayee and Musharraf almost resolved the Kashmir dispute and both the countries missed golden opportunity. So what is your take on this?
Let me answer the questions about US and Russia together. I think the role of both countries, Russia in the past, the Soviet Union in the past, and the United States more recently, has been exaggerated in India-Pakistan relations to some extent. India-Pakistan relations were influenced a great deal by relations between the United States and Soviet Union, and later between United States and Russia, and United States and China. But on the whole, they also have their own bilateral logic in which other countries do not play or cannot play much of a role. I would grant that the United States had a certain restraining role on Pakistan for some years. But that role now is no longer possible because of the deterioration and erosion in China, Pakistan, in US Pakistan relations. Whether China will play such a restraining role on Pakistan in the future, we don't know. It's too early to say. There's no evidence either way. So I would say that the role of both US and Russia, they're important powers. They have a certain role in the region, but it's easy to exaggerate that role. Both India and Pakistan are large countries by any standards. They have a great deal of experiencing of dealing with each other. And I don't think any other country can fulfill the primary responsibility of India and Pakistan of trying to improve relations. I don't think any external power can really do that. It's really for these two governments to do themselves. On the Vajpayee Musharraf, yes, people say that there was a certain understanding which was reached. My reading of that understanding is that it was not so much a resolution or a solution, but was an agreement on a process. And that process is no secret because people have said all kinds of things, but I don't think that the process they agreed upon was any secret. They felt that the only way to move forward was to try to improve relations. And this was good for India, good for Pakistan, and good also for Jammu and Kashmir and for people in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. That you could not address problems pertaining to Jammu and Kashmir without India and Pakistan improving their overall relationship. So I think this understanding was very important. The reason why that understanding could not make much progress is because of internal developments in Pakistan, and in particular that Musharraf was unable to sustain, was unable to build up a domestic consensus which would see this understanding to become part of a sustainable government policy. He antagonized too many people, and one of the casualties of that process was India-Pakistan relations.
So we are running out of time, so let me go with the last set of questions. We still have around 35 questions, but we'll just raise last 4 questions for today. Do you think the abrogation of Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir would impact India-Pakistan relations? Second, India has often accused Pakistan of using proxy war or giving sanctuary to terrorists who attack India. Pakistan in return states that they are victims of terrorism. So in this situation, is there any possibility of having joint mechanism to fight terrorism in the region? Third is, if you look at the tenure of Nawaz Sharif, Pervez Musharraf and Imran Khan, during whose tenure the relationship between the two countries flourished, whose tenure was more favorable for the peace in the region? Last question is, how do you observe the ongoing vicious information war campaign between Pakistan and India in both India and Pakistani media? What is the role of Indian and Pakistani media in hurting the relation of two countries?
Well, on Article 370 and Jammu and Kashmir, the Pakistani government and the Pakistani establishment has taken a very strong position. They have said that this amounts to an annexation of Jammu and Kashmir, that India has acted unilaterally. They have tried to take this matter to the UN Security Council, and certainly it has had an impact on, it had a very bad impact on relations. The question to ask is, why has the government of Pakistan taken this particular position? Because what is it that the government of India has done by the legislative changes which has changed the situation on the ground as far as Pakistan is concerned? If you look at it historically, Pakistan never gave importance to Article 370 till it was abrogated. They always said that the constitutional protections and the constitutional provisions with regard to Jammu and Kashmir are a sham. The governments there are puppet governments. They are spokespersons of Delhi. So why is there this sudden love for Article 370 and the state of Jammu and Kashmir after that article has been abrogated, or that state does not exist because it has been replaced by 2 union territories? I think they have, to my mind, the Pakistani reaction was a sentimental reaction driven, and the government allowed itself to be driven by this sentimental reaction because they feared that they would be outmaneuvered by the opposition in case they did not take such a strong line. There is no other rational explanation for the position which Pakistan has taken on this issue, because particularly, as I said, they never gave Article 370 any importance before this. If they thought that the state government of Jammu and Kashmir was so important, how is it that they never agreed to deal with that state government? I think the internal political dynamic in understanding why Pakistan took this particular stand is very important. And I think the reason why it did so had to do with the current government's internal political position, its weaknesses, and it has had an unfortunate impact on bilateral relations. But as I said, India-Pakistan relations go through cycles. it's by no means the case that this impact will be permanent or that the situation cannot improve in the future. Uh, it's useful to recall that the very important development of the Kartarpur Sahib opening uh, took place took place in November 2019, much after the legislative changes with regard to Jammu and Kashmir. So it just shows that possibilities always exist, but I think it was a sentimental reaction. It's a sentimental, non-rational position driven by internal politics. Questions of proxy war, and is Pakistan the perpetuator of a proxy war, or is it a victim of terrorism? I think the answer is yes to both. Pakistan is the perpetuator of a proxy war, but it is also the victim of terrorism. And the fact is that for the last 25 years, Pakistan has endeavored to use terrorists and terrorist groups as instruments of state policy. They think that these groups can help them achieve political objectives. These groups, history shows, always turn on the people who have created them, and Pakistan is very much a victim of the blowback from these terrorist groups when they act inside Pakistan. So if Pakistan thinks that they can deal with the domestic terrorist groups, but leave those who are carrying out activities against India or against Afghanistan or against other countries, I think it is again committing a fallacy. They must have a uniform policy towards all terrorist groups. Who was the most successful, Nawaz Sharif, Musharraf, or I think when General Musharraf was president of Pakistan, India-Pakistan relations saw a pretty good period between 2004 and 2006, 2007, 2 or 3 very good years. But I think the person who really could have taken India-Pakistan relations to a new level was Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. It is a great tragedy for Pakistan that he was not successful in this attempt, and the fact that he could not keep powerful interests, in particular the military, on his right side, led to these attempts ending in failure. But certainly I think while the Musharraf years saw some very good developments in India-Pakistan relations, the real potential would have been realized under Nawaz Sharif, but it's a misfortune that that did not happen. The third question was of information war. When relations are bad between countries, this information war, disinformation, the social media campaigns, all of them acquire a larger than life role. I don't think one can dissociate the overall state of the relationship with what happens on the media. And I think the media is not the prime mover. It is the overall state of the relationship which is the prime mover. But yes, I think you're right, or if that was the intent of the question, that the media can play a very negative role. And in my experience, when relations go down or when relations are going through a bad patch, the media contributes to a great deal to making that bad patch a very bad patch, or taking relations from bad to worse. What can be done about it is not so easy to answer. I think we can agree on the diagnosis of the problem, that the media can often play a very negative role. But what is the solution to this? I don't think there is any consensus, because sometimes intervening with the freedom of the media has other bad consequences also. So I don't think we have reached a stage where we can find a medicine to go with the diagnosis, but we can agree on the diagnosis.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your time. We are really grateful for your kind presentation and wonderful lecture and interaction. We hope to welcome you in Kathmandu in real in future when things are normalized. NICE would also love to collaborate with ICWA on research which are of mutual interest. Thank you very much once again for your time. We'd also like to thank all our participants for their presence and interesting questions. Thank you very much and have a nice day.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.